Imagine a world where modernity has just begun to show its first teeth, where steam tears through the silence of the mornings with its metallic roar, and the first locomotives cut across fields that had never seen anything faster than a galloping horse. A world where newspapers are printed by the thousands every hour, where gas lights the streets of the richest cities on Earth, where telescopes scan galaxies and microscopes reveal worlds invisible to the naked eye. A world where a young queen, 18 years old, rises to the throne with promises of greatness and presides over an empire that already swallows entire continents with an ambition that knows no borders. Now imagine that, in this same world, the overwhelming majority of the population still defecates in buckets. This is London in 1837, a city of contradictions so violent and so glaring that they can split the mind in two. On the outside, it is the most powerful capital on Earth, the nerve center of an empire that controls a quarter of the planet. On the inside, it is a biological bomb with the fuse already lit, an epic sanitary crisis disguised beneath layers of architectural grandeur, wool coats, and British pride. To understand what it means to live in this city, you must first abandon every reference your modern body carries. Forget the shower. Forget the faucet. Forget toilet paper, liquid soap, deodorant, the flushing toilet, the treated water that flows clean and cold at any hour of the day. Forget all of it, because none of it exists here. And what exists instead is a reality so raw, so physically intense, that history books rarely dare to describe it with complete honesty. The morning begins before the sun. In a narrow room in the East End tenements, where 5, 6, sometimes 7 people share a single space with walls damp from condensation and a ceiling so low that a tall man must slightly bend his head, the ritual of hygiene is brief, functional, and deeply limited by a poverty with no visible bottom. There are no pipes. There is no running water. There is no shower. There is a ceramic basin, cracked on one side, a jug of cold water brought from the public well the night before, and a single worn cloth that serves the entire family, morning after morning, without being washed in between. You dip the cloth into the cold water, wipe your face, wipe your hands. That is all. That is the limit of what this city's infrastructure in 1837 offers to most of the people who live in it. If you are lucky, there will be soap, not the soft, scented soap that the fine shops of the West End are already beginning to sell to aristocratic ladies, wrapped in delicate paper with French names. The soap that exists here is a dense, gray, acrid block made of animal fat and wood ash mixed and boiled in iron vats. It scratches more than it cleans. It leaves on the skin a strange smell of burnt grease that takes hours to fade. But it is what exists, and those who have access to it consider themselves fortunate. A full bath, the real and total immersion of the body in water, is an event that does not belong to the daily routine of almost anyone in this city, except the very rich. It is not something that happens every day. It is not something that happens every week. For most poor and working-class Londoners of 1,837, a full-body bath happens, at best, once a month. In many cases, with even longer intervals. And when it does happen, it is a logistical production of such magnitude that the process itself justifies the effort it demands. The water must be carried bucket by bucket from a public fountain or well, which may be several blocks away. It must be heated slowly over a coal stove, consuming fuel that costs money many families simply do not have in sufficient quantity. It must be poured carefully into a wooden or zinc tub placed in the center of the main room, where the entire family bathes in sequence in the same water, which grows darker with each person who steps in and out. And after all of this, the dirty water must be emptied the same way it arrived, bucket by bucket, carried to the street or thrown out the window. It is such a colossal effort, so time-consuming, so physically exhausting for people who already work 12, 14 hours a day in factories or workshops, that the bath becomes not a routine of hygiene, but a special event, an achievement, a luxury. For the rising middle class, this new and ambitious group beginning to define the contours of Victorian society, the situation is materially different, but not as distant as they would prefer to believe. In the red brick houses of neighborhoods like Islington, Clerkenwell, or the newer parts of Paddington, there is a separate room reserved for bathing, a copper or enameled zinc bathtub elegant enough to be displayed as a symbol of prosperity, a servant responsible for filling it with heated water. But even here, the water is not running. It arrives in the arms of someone from a lower class, carried upstairs in heavy buckets, poured carefully so it does not cool before the master or mistress of the house decides to step in. It is a process that depends entirely on the physical labor of another person. And that dependence is so naturalized that it rarely appears in the diaries and memoirs of the time as something worth noting. And the bath, even for them, is not daily. Respected Victorian doctors, men with degrees from Oxford and Edinburgh, publish serious articles in prestigious scientific journals arguing that excessive exposure to water weakens the body's constitution, that immersing oneself in hot water dangerously opens the pores of the skin, making the organism vulnerable to harmful drafts, that the frequent habit of bathing predisposes the lungs to tuberculosis, which at this moment is devastating the English population across all social classes with a ferocity that cemeteries can barely keep up with. Medical belief still carries echoes of the Middle Ages, transformed and refined by new scientific language, covered in Latin terminology and academic authority, but essentially fearful in the same way it had been for centuries. Water is still suspect. The body is still a fortress that must not be exposed without necessity. Instead of the bath, the elegant alternative for the middle class is the sponge. You stand on a thick towel folded on the bedroom floor. You dip a natural sponge imported from the Mediterranean into warm water, lightly scented with lavender or cologne, and you rub yourself methodically from head to toe, following a specific order that etiquette manuals of the time describe with a seriousness that today seems almost comic. It is a surface cleaning, a theater of hygiene. It condenses the mirror more than the skin. It removes the most visible dirt without touching the deeper layer of what accumulates on the body over days of work and urban life. But Victorian society elevates this ritual to the status of civilized and sufficient routine. Perfume does the rest. Never in English history had so much perfume been used to cover so little water. The perfume houses of the West End flourish as never before. Lavender, musk, rosewater, bergamot, and dozens of essences imported from the colonies are applied with a generosity that serves as an olfactory substitute for the cleanliness that does not happen. A Victorian gentleman may smell wonderful and have the skin at the back of his neck untouched by water and soap for 3 weeks. This is not considered a problem. It is considered normal. But if bathing is a logistical crisis managed with effort and creativity, the toilet is a philosophical and structural catastrophe of proportions that London in 1837 still has no tools to confront. In 1837, the word bathroom in most London houses does not describe a room with a porcelain toilet, a flushing system, running water pipes, and toilet paper hanging beside it. At best, it describes a side corridor or a small outdoor annex at the back of the yard where there is a latrine, a wooden or stone bench with a properly sized hole. Below the hole, a pit dug into the ground that slowly fills over weeks or months, depending on the size of the family and the frequency of use, until it must be emptied by men paid to do exactly that. The smell of this structure, even in winter, has no adequate description in polite language. In summer, it makes the yard virtually uninhabitable. In the poorest tenement houses, there's not even that. There's the bucket that sits in the corner of the room during the night, covered with a piece of wood or cloth when not in use, serving as a toilet for the entire family in the darkness of London's early hours. The bucket that has its own olfactory gravity, capable of defining and reorganizing the atmosphere of any enclosed space that contains it. In the morning, That bucket must be emptied. And here begins one of the most delicate and most ignored issues of Victorian urban life. The official answer, the one municipal authorities preach in notices and regulations that few read and even fewer obey, is that the contents of the bucket should be emptied into the backyard pit, carried to one of the communal latrines scattered throughout the city, or kept until the waste collectors pass by. The practical answer, the one that truly governs the morning of thousands of working families pressed by time and exhaustion, is simpler and more shocking. Out the window, into the street, into the nearest stream. The streets of the East End are, in many ways, an open-air collective toilet. The mud that covers the stones is not only mud. It is an organic mixture of human waste, horse and animal droppings, food scraps, stove ashes, and everything else the city discards without ceremony. To walk through those streets without looking where you step is an experience that leaves lasting marks both on your shoes and on your memory. And all of this ends up in one place, the Thames. The river that cuts through London in 1837 is not the Thames of modern postcards reflecting Parliament and the Tower of London in its clear waters. It is a sewer, a monumental, slow-moving repository of everything the most populous city in the world produces biologically, industrially, and domestically. Its banks are muddy and dark. Its surface, on hot days, produces bubbles of gas rising from the murky bottom. Its smell, even from considerable distances, is capable of making a man accustomed to the harshest conditions of industrial labor turn his face away and retreat with urgency. And this water, this very river, is the source of drinking water for a large part of London's population. Private water companies pump the Thames directly into the pipes of middle-class homes without any kind of filtration or treatment that makes any real difference against what is dissolved in it. In 1858, the stench of the Thames will become so unbearable during an exceptionally hot summer that it will force the British Parliament to suspend its sessions and close the windows with curtains soaked in chlorinated lime, hoping to block the smell invading the corridors of power. Historians will call this episode, with the bitter and precise sense of humor that only the English possess, the Great Stink. The Great Stink, and it will finally force the government to finance the construction of the sewer system the city should have built decades earlier. But in 1837, that moment is still 21 years in the future. For now, the city simply breathes its own poison, drinks its own contamination, and calls it normality. And after using the latrine, or the bucket, there is a question that no Victorian history book addresses with direct honesty. A question that the etiquette manuals of the time simply pretend does not exist. What happens next? There is no toilet paper. Commercial toilet paper, perforated and packaged for individual use, will only be patented in the United States in 1857, and it will take years to reach England in any form accessible to the general public. In 1837, what exists is improvisation, social hierarchy, and the unavoidable creativity of necessity. For the very rich, there are squares of soft linen or wool cut specifically for this purpose, washed by servants and reused. A solution that works, but depends on a domestic structure that the vast majority of people simply do not have. For the middle class, there are old newspapers, pages from almanacs and political pamphlets crumpled repeatedly until soft enough to serve the function. A solution that at least guarantees a certain level of functionality, although the printing ink leaves indelible marks that hygiene manuals of the time completely ignore. For the poor, there is whatever is available: leaves, hay, straw, pieces of torn fabric, moss when it can be found, and, with alarming frequency, simply the hand. The left hand, specifically. And it is not by accident that in so many cultures around the world, cultures that never had contact with one another, the left hand carries a silent and deep stigma. It is a biological memory, inscribed in customs and social taboos, a memory of a function that polite language in every era refuses to name directly, but that the human body, in its basic and insistent need, cannot ignore. Without disinfectant, without sufficient soap, without the slightest collective understanding of how bacteria and parasites spread from one body to another, the chain of contamination that forms from these habits is uninterrupted and invisible, operating quietly beneath every meal prepared, every hand extended in greeting, every piece of bread bought from a street bakery. The same hand that deals with the morning's waste needs the bread dough before lunch. The same bucket that serves as a toilet during the night is emptied near the water pump where the family collects the water they will drink and cook with. The direct link between these practices and the diseases that kill thousands of Londoners each year does not yet exist as established medical knowledge. The germ theory, the revolutionary understanding that microscopic and invisible organisms are the true vectors of infectious diseases, is still being born in European laboratories, still being met with skepticism and resistance by the medical establishment in every country. John Snow, a London doctor of quiet genius and impeccable method, will only manage to prove in 1854, during a devastating cholera outbreak in the Soho district, that the disease spreads through contaminated water and not through the air. And even after his irrefutable demonstration, mapping case by case the contamination that radiated from a single water pump on Broad Street, it will take decades for the medical community to fully accept what he showed. In 1837, most doctors still believed that disease travels through miasma, through corrupted and pestilent air, that the smell itself is the vector, that inhaling the stench of the Thames is what kills you, not drinking the water the Thames feeds. It is a tragic confusion, a partial inversion of causality that makes just enough sense to be plausible, because foul air and contaminated water often coexist in the same places. And it costs throughout the English 19th century a number of human lives that the records of the time cannot even quantify with precision. Cholera arrived in England for the first time in 1831, 6 years before the moment we are describing. It came from the East, as pandemics Europe does not know how to name always seem to come, carried by trade routes in the bodies of sailors. And it swept through London with a speed and cruelty that did not distinguish rich from poor, nobles from beggars, the devout from the atheist. In the East End tenements and the rookeries of street giles, where entire families were stacked into unventilated rooms and shared latrines with dozens of neighbors, it killed within days. A person would wake up with abdominal cramps in the morning. By late afternoon, they were so dehydrated they could barely sit upright. In many cases, they did not live to see the next sunrise. The mud-covered streets, already suffocating in daily life, became almost unbearable when bodies had to be carried out at a pace gravediggers could barely keep up with. But cholera did not remain confined to the poor, and that is what truly frightened the city. In the bourgeois homes of Bloomsbury and Marylebone, it entered through the kitchen. Carried by the water a servant fetched from the corner pump, pumped from the Thames that received the very sewage the city itself produced. It was democratic in its horror, and that democracy of suffering was the most terrifying thing London in 1837 had ever known. A city accustomed to believing that poverty protected the rich from the miseries of poverty discovered that there was a catastrophe that crossed any wall, any door, any difference of class. In 1837, cholera still hovers over the city like an unfulfilled promise, always about to return, waiting only for the right conditions to erupt again. And the right conditions, in this London of overcrowded tenements and a poisoned river, exist permanently. The popular response is not to change hygiene habits, not to question where the water comes from, not to improve the sanitation of the streets. It is to light more incense in churches, to carry small bags of aromatic herbs in pockets, to burn tar and sulfur in the streets to purify the air, to avoid neighborhoods where the smell is strongest, believing the smell is the danger and not the symptom. The logic is circular and tragic in equal measure. If bad air causes disease, then replacing it with better smelling air should solve the problem. And while the city debates theories and burns perfumes, the river continues to receive everything. The water pump continues to operate, and the cycle continues to turn. And meanwhile, in the depths of the London night, another group of men fights a different and infinitely more solitary battle against the city's waste. They are the night soilmen, the nocturnal collectors of human waste, required by municipal regulation to work exclusively after midnight and before dawn, so that polite, daytime London is spared the sight and the smell of the labor that makes its existence possible. They arrive with covered carts, long-handled shovels, faces wrapped in cloths, soaked in vinegar, the only protection they have against the vapors waiting inside the pits. The work is exactly what it sounds like, and worse. They descend into the pits with buckets and shovels, sometimes working with the material up to their waists, manually removing what the city has accumulated, loading it into carts that then carry it to farms on the outskirts of London where the waste is sold as fertilizer. It completes a cycle with perfect economic logic, but it demands from the men who operate it a physical and psychological price no wage can truly compensate. It is a profession that kills in specific and terrible ways. The vapors that accumulate inside a closed, decomposing pit, a mixture of methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other gases produced by anaerobic decomposition, can reach concentrations high enough to kill a man within minutes. Without warning, without visible pain, without any external sign that allows the men above to understand what happened in time to intervene. Men enter pits and do not come out. Those who try to rescue them sometimes die as well. In the same darkness, before they understand what is happening, they are not mentioned in newspapers, except when someone dies in a way dramatic enough to justify a paragraph. They are not celebrated. They are not remembered. They are the invisible condition upon which Victorian greatness is built, the foundation no one wants to see, because to see would imply recognition, and recognition would imply responsibility. Above ground, while the night soul men work in the shadows, the streets of London during the day reveal the second invisible army of urban sanitation. Street sweepers and rag and bone collectors who move through the city at dawn, before movement begins, gathering whatever can be reused and trying, with primitive tools and finite strength, to contain the tide of debris produced incessantly by a city of more than 2 million people. Horses, the true engines of London in 1837, deposit tons of manure in the streets every single day. Estimates from the time suggest that each horse produces around 15 kilograms of manure daily, and there are tens of thousands of horses circulating through the city. Sweepers collect part of it to sell as fertilizer, but the amount that escapes into gutters and alleys far exceeds the capacity of any cleaning system that exists at that moment. The result is a city that is literally inhaled before it is seen. Foreign travelers arriving in London for the first time invariably describe the smell as their first impression of the city. Before the smoke of the chimneys, before the noise of iron wheels on cobblestones, before the crowds, the smell arrives first. A dense mixture of burned coal, animal manure, organic mud, the sourness of tanneries and breweries, and the permanent, inescapable undertone of human sewage that the Thames breathes back into the city on days of high tide. In this era, you do not simply see the city. You experience it with all your senses at once, and not all of those senses are pleased by what they find. It is tempting to look at this portrait and see only the dirt. It is tempting to look at these men and women who wake before the sun, who wash with a piece of damp cloth, who use buckets and pits and improvise with what they have, and feel only the comfortable distance of someone who knows what comes next. But what 1837 represents, when viewed with care and honesty, is something far more complicated and far more human than simply a catalogue of shortages. It is the turning point, the exact historical moment when humanity finally begins to question what it had accepted as inevitable for millennia. The tension between what technology is already capable of doing and what infrastructure still does not provide reaches, at this point, a level that progress itself makes unsustainable. The young queen who ascends the throne in 1837 will reign for 63 years. And over the course of that extraordinarily long reign, the world around her will change in ways she herself, on the morning of her coronation, cannot imagine. The engineer Joseph Bazalgette will build a sewer system that saves London from itself, carving miles of tunnels beneath the city to carry waste away from the river the city drinks from. Germ theory will triumph. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch will demonstrate to the world what John Snow sensed in Soho. Cholera will be understood, fought, and finally controlled. Toilet paper will be invented, industrialized, and distributed. Running water will reach homes, first the upper classes, then gradually everyone. Cheap and effective soap will become so accessible that its absence, not its presence, will mark poverty. All of this is still to come. All of this progress, all of this transformation exists only as unrealized possibility in the air of this morning in 1837. For now, a woman in the East End wakes before the sun, washes her face with a damp cloth and cold water from the night before, empties the bucket out the window into the street already beginning to fill with life and mud, and begins her day. She does not know she is living on a historical frontier. She does not know the world is about to change in ways she could not name, even if she had the words to try. She does not know that 100 years from now, people will look at the way she lives and feel a mixture of horror and admiration she herself would not recognize. She knows only what she knows, that life is hard, that winter is long and damp, that the factory starts at 6 in the morning, that the children must be fed, that the well water looks clean today, and that, for now, that will have to be enough. The history of hygiene in the Victorian era is not a story of ignorance or neglect. It is the story of an entire civilization living at the exact edge between two worlds, with one foot still planted in the millennia-old practices it inherited without question, and the other already touching, without realizing it, the ground of the modern world it is about to build. It is the story of people who faced the harshest conditions with the dignity available to them, who invented solutions for problems they did not yet know how to name correctly, who survived epidemics they did not yet understand, who built the greatest commercial empire in human history while emptying buckets out the window and dying from a disease that came from the water pump on the corner. We should not look at them with disgust. We should look at them with the honesty of those who understand that progress is not linear, that greatness and misery always coexist, and that the distance between what a civilization can achieve and what it still fails to solve is always the most revealing place to look if you want to understand who it truly is. In 1837, that distance smelled like the Thames in August. And even so, the city moved forward.